The shovel rang against the stone with a dull, final clang that vibrated up the hickory handle and into Elias's bones. He stood back, breathing slowly in the cool autumn air, his breath a pale ghost in the slanted afternoon light. Before him, half buried in the rich black soil of the North Meadow, was the reason his father had bought this unforgiving parcel of land. It was a granite monolith, a glacial erratic the size of a small cottage, smooth on its windward side and fissured on the other. The old-timers called it the Heartstone. Elias's father had called it the Anchor. Beside him, a lanky brown dog with intelligent amber eyes whined softly and nudged a cold nose into his master's hand. Elias rested his palm on the dog's head, the coarse fur a familiar comfort. "It's all right, Boro. This is the spot." Boro thumped his tail twice against the earth, a gesture of unwavering trust. Elias was 19. The land was his now, along with the small, drafty cabin his parents had lived and died in, and a set of journals filled with his father's precise, angular script. It was those journals that had led him here, to this shovel, to this impossible stone. He was not digging to move it. He was digging to build around it. The plan, sketched on vellum with draftsman's care, was laid out in the journal entry for his last birthday. The earth holds its heat in the deep places. A stone this large is a piece of the deep earth brought to the surface. It is a battery for the cold. It will store the sun of August and give it back in January. Conventional thinking builds away from the rock. We will build into it. Elias had read the words 100 times until they felt like his own. He picked up the shovel again and began to mark the perimeter, a wide semicircle that used the flat eastern face of the Heartstone as its foundation. The work was slow, his body still lean and wiry from a youth spent following his father rather than leading. His hands, though tough, were not yet the broad, calloused shovels of a man who had spent a lifetime at war with the land. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged line of pines to the west, he had only managed to trace a shallow, 18-inch wide trench in the dirt. It looked like a child's game, a foolish line drawn around an immovable truth. A voice, thick with the gravel of 70 winters, cut through the quiet. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Elias didn't startle. He had heard the crunch of boots on dry leaves for the last minute. He finished his shovelful, set the blade carefully into the earth, and turned. It was Mr. Gable, his nearest neighbor from a half-mile down the valley road. He stood with his hands on his hips, a stout, barrel-chested man whose face was a road map of harvests and blizzards. "Looks like you're trying to bury the one thing on this land that won't be buried." Elias wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. "Building a home, Mr. Gable." Gable squinted, his eyes scanning the absurd arc in the dirt, the colossal stone, and the thin young man standing between them. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was more disbelief than humor. "A home? Here? What, are you going to use that rock for a back wall? Wait until the first real freeze. That stone will suck every bit of warmth out of whatever you build. It'll be an icebox. You'll be frozen solid by Christmas." Elias looked at the Heartstone, its gray surface glowing pink in the setting sun. He thought of his father's words, "A battery for the cold." He looked back at Gable. "I have a plan." "A plan," Gable repeated, shaking his head. He gestured with a thumb back towards the old cabin, barely visible through the trees. "You've got a perfectly good house right there. A bit of chinking, a new stovepipe, and she'll see you through. This is a fool's errand, Elias. Your father was a good man, but he always did have peculiar ideas." He turned and started walking away, his boots making angry sounds on the path. "Don't say I didn't warn you when you're chipping ice off your blankets." Elias watched him go. He felt the familiar sting of doubt, the cold voice that sounded so much like common sense. He looked down at Boro, who was watching him, his head cocked. The dog's gaze was steady, unquestioning. Elias took a deep breath, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. He picked up the shovel. The trench needed to be 3 feet deep. He had a long way to go before dark. This was the work. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of labor that was as predictable as the sun's shortening arc across the sky. Elias rose before dawn, ate a standing breakfast of bread and cold bacon, and walked with Boro to the hearthstone. He dug. The trench deepened, the pile of excavated earth growing into a small mountain beside it. His shoulders ached, his back burned, and his hands bled, healed and bled again, the new calluses forming tough, yellow ridges over the tender skin. He learned the language of the soil, the soft give of the topsoil, the stubborn resistance of the clay layer, the frustrating clatter of shovel on rock that meant he had to dig out another stone, some the size of his fist, others the size of his head. When the trench was finally complete, a perfect half moon 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, he began mixing concrete. He did it by hand in a wooden trough his father had built for mixing feed, using sand and gravel hauled in his old wheelbarrow from the creek bed a 1/4 mile away. Each bag of cement weighed 94 pounds. He could only haul 2 at a time from the general store in town, a 5-mile trip each way. The process was punishingly slow. Mix, pour, smooth. Mix, pour, smooth. Boro would lie in the sun, his head on his paws, watching the endless, repetitive motion. Mrs. Gable sometimes stopped by on her way back from town, her expression a mixture of pity and concern. "Elias, dear," she'd say, leaning out the window of her husband's truck. "Are you eating enough? You look thin as a rail. There's a casserole on your porch. You can bring the dish back whenever." She never mentioned the strange semicircle of concrete growing around the boulder. It was her husband's domain to voice the community's skepticism, and voice it he did. Every few days, Gable would find a reason to walk his property line, his path always taking him within hailing distance of Elias's project. "Still at it, I see," he'd call out, his voice carrying on the wind. "That's more concrete than I used for my whole barn foundation. You building a fortress?" Elias would just nod, his arms slick with sweat and gray slurry. "Foundation needs to be strong." One afternoon, a flatbed truck rumbled up the rutted lane, gears grinding in protest. It carried the disassembled pieces of a Quonset hut, its curved steel ribs stacked like the bones of a great metal beast. The driver, a man from a town 50 miles away, helped Elias unload it, piece by heavy piece. "Building a barn?" the driver asked, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "A house," Elias said, his voice quiet. The driver paused, looking at the concrete trench, the giant boulder, and the pile of steel. "A house? Huh. Never seen one like that." He shrugged, took the $17 Elias counted into his hand, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the scent of diesel. The arrival of the steel changed the nature of the skepticism. It was no longer a boy digging a strange hole. It was a real, tangible structure. Gable brought 2 other men from the valley with him the next day. They stood at a distance, arms crossed, their postures identical. "It's a military hut," one of them said, a farmer named Peterson. "Meant for barracks, cold in the winter, hot in the summer, no insulation to speak of." "He's going to bolt it right to that rock," Gable said, his tone one of a man explaining a baffling natural phenomenon. "Going to create the biggest frost heave you've ever seen. It'll tear the whole thing apart by spring." Elias heard them, but he didn't look up. He was sorting the steel panels, laying them out in the order they would be assembled. He consulted the dog-eared instruction manual, then his father's journal. The journal had a modification on page 47. The standard assembly is for open ground. To anchor to the heartstone, a new method is required. A channel must be left. He began the painstaking process of raising the first rib. It was 18 feet long and weighed over 100 pounds. Getting it upright and into the anchor bolts he'd set in the concrete was a battle of leverage and sheer will. He'd heave it up, it would slip, and he'd start again, his grunts lost in the vast quiet of the meadow. Boro watched, a low whine of concern in his throat. He was struggling with the third rib, the awkward weight of it threatening to pull him over, when a new voice spoke, softer than the ones he was used to. "Do you need a hand with that?" He turned, blinking sweat from his eyes. A young woman stood there, holding a canvas bag. She had hair the color of autumn straw, and clear, curious eyes. It was Anya, the town librarian's daughter, who had just returned from college in the city. He'd seen her in town but had never spoken to her. Elias was not a man of easy words. He looked at the steel rib, then at her. "It's heavy." "I'm stronger than I look," she said with a small smile. She set her bag down. "Tell me where to lift." Together, they wrestled the rib into place. Her presence was a silent counterpoint to his solitary labor. She didn't ask what he was building or why he was building it there. She just watched his hands, saw where the pressure was, and applied her own strength to balance it. When the rib was bolted fast, she stepped back, rubbing her palms on her jeans. "My father said you were building something interesting," she said, her gaze moving from the steel skeleton to the heartstone. "He said it was based on geothermal principles." Elias stared at her. No one had used a word like geothermal. They had used words like foolish and crazy. "Your father is the librarian?" "He reads a lot," she said, as if that explained everything. "He found an old geological survey of this valley. It talks about that stone, how deep it goes. It's the tip of something immense." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos. "I brought you some coffee. It's getting cold." He took the cup she offered, his rough, dirty fingers brushing against hers. The warmth of it seeped into his hands. "Thank you." "I'll come by tomorrow," she said, picking up her bag. "4 hands are better than 2. She walked away before he could object, leaving him standing in the skeletal shadow of his new home, the taste of warm coffee on his lips. Anya came the next day, and the day after that. She learned to hold the bolts, to tighten the nuts, to guide the heavy steel panels into place as Elias hauled them up the ladder. She talked as they worked, her voice a low, pleasant murmur against the clang of metal. She told him about her studies, about the city, about the books she loved. He, in turn, began to speak more, not about his feelings, but about the work. He explained the importance of the neoprene washers on the bolts, the way the panels had to overlap by exactly 3 inches to be watertight, the reasoning behind the double-paned window frames he was building for the end caps. He showed her his father's journal, the elegant script and the precise drawings. She traced a finger over a diagram of the flue system. "He was an engineer?" "A thinker," Elias corrected gently. "He read books, like your father." Working together, the structure took shape with astonishing speed. The curved walls of corrugated steel rose up and over, meeting the flat face of the heartstone. This was the most critical juncture. Elias, following his father's notes, did not bolt the structure directly to the rock. Instead, he left a 6-inch channel between the final rib and the stone's surface. He spent a week meticulously flashing the gap with copper sheeting, creating a deep U-shaped gutter. Then, he filled it. He melted gallons of pitch over an open fire, the black, tarry smoke staining the autumn air. He and Anya packed the channel with oakum, a dense, fibrous rope, and then poured the molten pitch over it, layer by layer, until the gap was a solid black waterproof seal that could expand and contract with the changing temperatures. Gable watched this process from his usual distance, his expression one of profound bewilderment. "He's tarring a rock," he told Peterson at the general store. "Like he's trying to caulk a battleship. The boy's lost his mind entirely." The final step before closing in the end caps was the insulation. Elias bought dozens of bales of raw, greasy wool from a sheep farmer, paying for it with the last of his parents' savings. He packed the 4-inch space between the interior and exterior walls with the dense wool. Then he built interior walls of rough-sawn pine, creating a sealed envelope. His father's journal was specific. "The hut is a coat. The stone is the body. The coat must be thick." By the first snowfall in late November, the Quonset was complete. From the outside, it was an odd silver half-cylinder pressed against a giant gray rock, with a single stovepipe poking out at a strange angle where it emerged from the stone itself. Inside, it was one large, curved room, smelling of fresh-cut pine, wool, and curing pitch. A cast-iron stove stood near the center, its flue pipe running horizontally for 10 feet before entering a carefully drilled channel in the hearthstone, turning 90 degrees and ascending 30 feet through the solid granite to the sky. It had taken Elias a month of painstaking work with a star drill and a sledgehammer to create that channel, his father's diagrams his only guide. Anya brought a housewarming gift, a thermometer for the inside wall and another for the outside. They hung them up. That first night, as a wet, heavy snow blanketed the valley, the temperature outside dropped to 20 degrees. Inside, with a small fire in the stove, it was a comfortable 65. The true test, however, was what happened after the fire went out. Elias let the stove die down to embers around 10 o'clock. He and Boro curled up under a single wool blanket. The air in the hut cooled, but slowly, reluctantly. He woke at dawn to a profound quiet. The world was buried in a foot of snow. The outside thermometer read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at the one inside. It read 53. The stone wall, warm to the touch, was radiating a gentle, persistent heat into the room. It was working. A slow smile spread across Elias's face. He laid a hand on the rock. It felt alive. The real cold arrived in the second week of January. It came not as a storm, but as a silent, invisible siege. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue, but the air had a crystalline bite that stole the breath and froze the moisture in a man's nostrils. For a week, the temperature never rose above 0, and at night it plunged to 20, then 30 below. The valley hunkered down. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight white columns. The old-timers knew this kind of cold. It was a killer. It found the smallest crack, the weakest wall, the shallowest root. Inside the Quonset, Elias lived in a different world. He kept a modest fire in the stove during the day, enough to cook on and to heat the granite flue. The hearthstone absorbed the heat like a sponge. By evening, the entire rock face that formed the back wall of his home was a massive, gentle radiator. At night, when the fire died down and the temperature outside plummeted to a terrifying -38, the stone gave back its stored warmth. The lowest the temperature inside the hut ever dropped was 49 degrees. Most mornings it was a steady 52. He wore a sweater, but he was never cold. Buro, who in the old cabin would have spent the night shivering in a tight ball, now slept stretched out on the wooden floor, his paws occasionally twitching in a dream chase. Elias would stand outside for a few minutes each morning, the brutal cold a physical shock, just to feel the difference. He'd look at the smoke rising from the gable's chimney, a thick, panicked plume that spoke of a stove being fed constantly, a desperate battle being waged against the invading chill. He felt a quiet, solid satisfaction. It wasn't pride. It was the simple peace of a thing working as it was designed to. His father had been right. The blizzard began on a Tuesday. It was foreshadowed by a strange yellow-gray light and a sudden drop in pressure that made the ears pop. Boulder grew restless, pacing the length of the hut and whining at the door. Elias went out to chop an extra load of firewood. The air was unnaturally still, the silence profound. He could hear the frantic chirping of birds seeking shelter in the thickest pines. He saw Gable out by his barn, hurrying to get his cattle inside, his movements jerky and anxious. They didn't exchange words, just a brief, grim nod across the frozen expanse. By noon, the first flakes began to fall, small and dry, skittering across the frozen crust of the old snow. By 3 o'clock, the sky had vanished, replaced by a churning, horizontal wall of white. The wind arrived with a low moan that quickly rose to a shrieking, deafening roar. It was a sound that seemed to want to tear the world apart. Elias went inside, bolted the door, and checked the fire. The stovepipe, encased in 30 feet of solid granite, barely vibrated. The hut itself was silent. The wind screamed over its curved roof, finding no flat surface to push against, no eaves to tear at. It was like being in a submarine deep beneath a raging sea. He sat with Anya, who had come over that morning with a basket of books and stew, sensing the weather was about to turn. They listened to the storm, a distant, abstract fury. Inside, the air was calm and warm. The stone wall radiated its steady, comforting heat. Boulder slept at Elias's feet, untroubled. They read by the light of a kerosene lamp, the world outside reduced to a single, savage noise. The storm raged for 2 days. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, burying fences, swallowing sheds, climbing the walls of the houses in the valley. On the second night, sometime after midnight, a new sound penetrated the storm's roar. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the door. Boulder shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. He opened the door a crack. A blast of snow and wind tore into the room, and 2 figures, caked in white, stumbled inside. It was Mr. and Mrs. Gable. Their faces were pale with cold and fear. Mrs. Gable was crying, her hands wrapped in a shawl that was stiff with ice. Gable's eyebrows and mustache were frozen solid. "Our furnace went out," Gable managed to say, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The pilot light blew out, and we can't get it relit. The house, it's as cold as outside. We saw your light." Anya was already helping Mrs. Gable out of her frozen coat, leading her toward the warmth of the stone wall. Elias closed and bolted the door, sealing out the storm once more. He handed Mr. Gable a tin mug of hot coffee from the pot that was always on the stove. The older man's hands shook so badly he could barely hold it. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the single small fire in the stove. He saw the thermometer on the wall, its needle pointing to 68 degrees. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone wall. His expression was one of utter astonishment. It's warm," he whispered. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, the skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, humbling understanding. "How?" Elias looked at the great stone that formed the heart of his home. "It holds the heat," he said simply. They were the first, but not the last. By morning, the wind had died down, though the snow still fell. Another neighbor, the Petersons, arrived, their youngest child wrapped in every blanket they owned, his breathing shallow. Their propane tank had been buried by a drift, and their lines had frozen. They too had seen the light from Elias's window, a lone beacon in the white wilderness. Elias and Anya welcomed them in. The Quonset, once a place of solitary work, became a sanctuary. The small space was crowded with 7 people and a dog, but it was warm. It was safe. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the world was transformed. It was a landscape of pure, sculpted white, beautiful and deadly. The snow was piled 10 feet high against the north-facing walls of the valley's houses. Drifts blocked every road. The valley was cut off. But inside the Quonset hut, life went on. They had food, water from melted snow, and most importantly, they had warmth. Gable, who had spent his life believing he understood the cold, sat on a wooden crate, staring at the stone wall, shaking his head over and over again. On the 5th day, he looked at Elias, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of his admission. "I was wrong, son," he said, the words coming hard. "I was a fool. I laughed at you. I called you crazy." He gestured around the warm, life-filled room. "This place, what you built, you saved us. You saved our lives." Elias was tending the fire. He added a single small log. He did not look at Gable. "It's a good design," he said. "My father drew it up." The thaw came a week later. As the roads were cleared and life in the valley slowly returned to a semblance of normal, the story of what had happened spread. People came to see the strange house built against the rock. They came not to mock, but to learn. They would stand in the doorway, feeling the impossible warmth, and ask the same question Gable had. How? Elias, a man of few words, would simply point to the stone. The earth keeps its heat. He never boasted. He never said, "I told you so." He just answered their questions. He showed them his father's journals, the pages worn thin with use. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of passive solar gain, of using the earth itself as an ally against the cold, not an enemy to be defeated. He became, in his quiet way, a teacher. Gable was his first and most devoted student. The following summer, Gable and his 2 sons built a new workshop, its north wall made of thick, fieldstone-filled concrete, dug deep into the hillside. He consulted Elias on every step. Anya stayed. Her temporary visit had become something permanent, woven into the fabric of the place. She and Elias were married the following autumn, in the meadow in front of the Hearthstone. The whole valley came. The years passed as they do, measured in seasons, in harvests, in the lines that slowly etched themselves around Elias's eyes. The Quonset hut became a landmark. The stone house, people called it. More like it began to appear in the valley, not exact copies, but homes and barns built on the same principle, with stone hearts and thick coats, nestled into the landscape instead of perched upon it. The lessons of the Great Blizzard had been learned. The community was warmer, safer, more resilient. Elias and Anya raised 2 children in the house against the rock. The children learned to read from the books Anya brought home, and to build from the way their father's hands moved, always fixing, always improving. Boro grew old, his muzzle turning gray, his movements slow and deliberate. He spent his days sleeping in the patch of sun that fell on the floor, his back pressed against the warm stone. One spring morning, Elias found him there, sleeping his final, peaceful sleep. He buried him on the small rise behind the hut, overlooking the meadow, and placed a simple, flat fieldstone to mark the spot. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cold marker, his heart full of a quiet, aching grief for the loyal witness who had been there from the very first shovelful. Elias himself grew old. His hair turned the color of winter frost, but his back remained strong, and his hands, though scarred and thick with knuckles, were still steady. He became the old-timer, the one people came to for advice about the weather, about building, about the right way to set a foundation so the frost wouldn't heave it. He would sit with them, Anya by his side, and share what he knew. His voice still quiet, his words still carefully chosen. He often walked out to the Heartstone, laying a hand on its ancient, weathered surface. It felt like an old friend. The battery, his father had called it. It had powered his whole life. When his time came, decades after the Great Blizzard, he died in the home he had built, in the bed that stood against the warm stone wall, with Anya holding his hand. They buried him next to Boro, on the rise overlooking the meadow. His children carved a simple inscription into a piece of granite taken from the same valley. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It just said, Elias. He built for the cold and gave us warmth. Long after he was gone, the house remained. The steel, now weathered to a soft, matte gray, still curved against the unyielding granite of the Heartstone. Through fierce winters and gentle summers, it stood not as a monument to one man's strange idea, but as proof that the most profound wisdom is often quiet, patient, and born of the earth itself. It stood as a testament to the stubborn boy who listened to the voice of his father and the silent counsel of a great stone, and in doing so, built a home that held the warmth for generations to come.